This is Professor Rod Evans, and this is the final review for Philosophy 110P. I want to make clear that you students should also have the completed test review, which is of course in written form, which you should also be studying. And sometimes people ask me, they go, Professor, what is the best way to study for the final exam? And there's no one best way, but I can tell you what I think would be optimal for most people. And what would that be? Well, let's look at this. How to study for the final. Let's see if I can get this in focus. Okay, 1. Closely reread the assigned readings. Whoops. Closely reread the assigned readings. 2. Closely study the completed review sheet I've given you. Create and use repeatedly the flashcards from the completed review sheet. And that you can have terms on there and their definitions. You can have the positions of the various philosophers. And you can shuffle your cards and go over them repeatedly. And then repeatedly watch this review lecture while pausing it to paraphrase content. So that, in other words, try to teach what you've just learned in your own words. Believe it or not, I mean, it'd be good to do that with someone in your family or to a friend. You could paraphrase some key points. But even if you had this idea that you're going to paraphrase key points and create your own mini lecture, and you started lecturing a bunch of stuffed animals, even if you did that, that would be better than just passively reading the material and not trying to use it, not trying to paraphrase it, not trying to recall it in flashcards. Okay, so let's go over then this review sheet. Okay, according to Hick, John Hick, is evil real or unreal? Now, by the way, I just want to emphasize that this final test or final exam is going to be on all the material you've had after the first test. So in other words, all the material that was covered on the second test, all the material covered on the third test, and then there'll be one question from the last essay called A Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. Okay? In any event, according to John Hick, is evil real or unreal? The short answer is that it's real. In fact, in his essay on the problem of evil, Hick says there's certain attempted solutions to the problem of evil that he rejects from the beginning. And one of them is the belief that evil is somehow unreal, that it's a shadow, but it's without substance, that it's an illusion in some sense. Well, he doesn't believe that. He believes evil is quite real. He believes that the suffering caused by evil is quite real, and so he does believe that evil is quite real. He says that what we need to do is to try to understand its possible meaning. We need to try to reduce evil, but try to learn from it and try to develop ourselves morally and spiritually using the evil. Can evil serve a valuable role in our development? If so, how? Well, at the center of John Hick's theory of evil, at the center of it is the, we could call it, it's a soul-making theodicy, right? A theodicy, Theodicy, is a religious explanation of evil. It's an attempt to try to explain how evil can exist in some level, how it can exist, and yet how God can also coexist with the evil. So again, it's a religious explanation of evil. Now, what do we want to say about this, about the idea that evil can serve a valuable role in our development? According to Hick, evil can serve, of course, a valuable role in our development, moral and spiritual development. In fact, Hick would say that evil performs an essential role in our moral and spiritual development. Now, why does he say that? Well, according to Hick, we cannot have moral and spiritual development without evil, because we need, for example, to have danger if we're going to exercise courage and develop the virtue of courage. We need to have harm or wrongdoing if we're going to develop forgiveness and exercise forgiveness. We need to have obstacles and inconveniences if we're going to develop and exercise patience. We need to have misfortune if we're going to develop and exercise sympathy. So the idea then is that we need to have a world containing both good and evil for us to develop morally and spiritually. Okay, and so we need a world that's morally mixed, just as we ourselves are morally mixed, where, if you like, a combination of both good and evil, and we have the potential for good or evil. How does Hick appeal to free will? Well, Hick believes that God does not want robots or automata, but rather he believes that God gave us the gift of free will, and then God wants us to use that free will to develop morally and spiritually. So free will is an essential ingredient in Hick's explanation of evil. And with free will comes the capacity for doing good or evil. And then how does Hick appeal to the logical connection between many goods and evils? Well, in a way I've already just covered it, because when I said that you can't have courage without danger, you can't have sympathy without misfortune, you can't have forgiveness without something to forgive, wrongdoing or harm, you can't have patience without inconvenience or obstacles. So in other words, the fact is that goods and evils are conceptually tied together, and you can't have the virtues without having a background of evils. And Hick believed that we need moral challenges for us to develop morally and spiritually. I mean, conceive of a world, if you can, in which there's no danger. Conceive of a world in which there's no harm or wrongdoing. Conceive or imagine a world in which you get whatever you want whenever you want. Well, then there would be no need for self-discipline. There would be no need for patience. There would be no need for forgiveness. There would be no need for courage. In other words, it would be a world in which it may be fun, perhaps, but it certainly wouldn't be a world in which we could develop morally and spiritually. And then the question is, what is Hick's view of hell? The short answer to this is that if you think of hell as a state or a condition in which God is just giving up on people, in which there's no room for moral improvement, in which people are more or less frozen in a state of damnation without any hope, Hick rejects hell in that sense. Hick believes that ultimately everyone will be saved once people become fully morally and spiritually developed. Okay, so Hick is also opening up the possibility of either other worlds or reincarnation, because Hick also believes that at times one lifetime isn't enough for people to become completely morally and spiritually developed. But the key thing for you to remember is that Hick believes that God is analogous to an ideal parent, but that there's a difference. An ideal parent with unlimited power and unlimited goodness. And so the idea is that God wants what is best for God's children, according to Hick. And Hick believes that what's best for God's children, in other words, human beings, is for human beings to develop morally and spiritually and to be with God in heaven after they've completed that moral and spiritual development. So the short answer to Hick's view of hell, again, if you think of hell as a place or condition that's absolutely hopeless, where there's no room for further improvement, then Hick rejects a belief in hell in that sense. Now, as to Menninger, we know that Menninger was a very highly esteemed and influential psychiatrist, especially in the 1960s. We know that he published a book, and the book was on the criminal justice system, okay, and it's The Crime of Punishment, okay, which is wordplay, right? Because Menninger believed that the usual way in which Americans punish criminals is itself criminal, that it makes things more likely to be worse, and rather than to improve things. But in any event, according to Menninger, the main purpose of punishment is reformation. In other words, to turn criminals into productive, law-abiding citizens. Okay, that's the main purpose. You could also say Another important purpose would be deterrence or discouraging crime. But if you had to mention what would be central for Menninger, it would be reformation. Does Menninger believe that American criminals are treated too harsh? Yes, too harshly. Menninger believed that most Americans want criminals to suffer, but they don't want them. They don't really care whether they get reformed, and so that's why he says prisons are such hellish places, because that's what most Americans want. They want criminals to suffer, and most Americans are really don't want criminals to get better, and he says that's sad, and he's trying to, in his book, The Crime of Punishment, which was published in 1968, he was trying to get Americans to change their attitude toward crime, well, particularly toward criminals. Okay, now, why does Menninger think that we like to punish criminals? Menninger had an interesting theory, and Menninger believed that Americans are often fascinated by crime, and especially crime that such as really that there's a lot of thought involved, such as some of you have seen elaborate thefts in Las Vegas in movies, let's say, and you also know that historically Americans have treated certain bank robbers, whether it's Jesse James and his brother Frank, or whether it's John Dillinger, they treated bank robbers and various criminals as folk heroes, Bonnie and Clyde and so on. And so there's a kind of fascination with certain kinds of crime. But at the same time, according to Menninger, Americans pride themselves on wanting to punish criminals. Now, why is this? According to Menninger, most Americans, if not all, but certainly most, have criminal desires, even if they don't act on them. And so by punishing criminals or wanting criminals to be punished severely, Americans feel purged of the guilt that they have. In other words, they have guilty consciences for having criminal desires. And by calling for severe punishment of criminals, according to Menninger, Americans feel relieved of their own guilt. That's why he calls criminals our scapegoats. Okay, now, does Menninger believe that reformation of most criminals is possible? Indeed, he does. In fact, Menninger believes that if Americans were really serious about reformation and put the kind of effort and money and resources and time into reformation, that we could reform most criminals. He thinks that maybe some of them are going to be incurably criminal, okay? But he thinks that most criminals are capable of reformation. Now, C.S. Lewis, you need to understand that C.S. Lewis was a contrast for Menninger. In other words, why do we read Lewis? Well, Lewis has a view that in certain ways is sharply different from Menninger's. Because you see, Lewis was defending what is called retributivism, or the retributivist view of punishment. Now, what is retributivist view of punishment? What does it say? What it says is this. It says that criminals should be punished because and to the extent that they deserve it. That's what retributivism says. And that's what Lewis believed. In fact, Lewis believed that theory of retributivism directly connects punishment with justice. It says punishment can be just or unjust, and that just punishment has to be deserved. Now, that's Lewis's position. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about retributivism, because Lewis is clearly defending retributivism. So according to retributivism, we should punish criminals because and to the extent that they deserve it. Okay? So retributivism says that society sets certain minimal standards of decency embodied in the law, and if people fall short of that and they intentionally violate the law, that in a sense they've chosen to profit from violating the law, that in a world in which most people obey the law. So they're trying to derive unjustly a benefit from a system. and they have therefore incurred a debt to society. They've, in a sense, they've upset the moral balance by their crime, and to help redress that balance, and they need to pay for their debt. So I know you've heard that expression, someone served time in prison and he or she says, I've paid my debt to society. That's retributism. Retributism says criminals have incurred a debt to society by committing the crime, and by being punished, they're paying their debt. Okay, that's retributism. Retributism says you punish only the guilty, you punish them because they're guilty, and you punish them according to the nature and seriousness of their crimes. It says the punishment should fit the crime. All of that is retributivism, all of it. Okay, now, the other thing is, how does retributivism contradict Menninger's view? Well, Menninger was an opponent of retributivism. Menninger believed that retributivism is vindictive. It's seeking revenge. It's inhumane. He thought it's ineffective. He thought it usually makes people into more hardened criminals. So Menninger opposed retributivism and wanted us to get rid of it entirely from the criminal justice system. Whereas Lewis believed that retributivism is essential to treating individual criminals justly, and that requires looking at what they've done and then judging how serious it was and then holding them accountable for it. Okay, so again, Menninger rejected retributivism, C.S. Lewis defended it. And I've talked about what retributivism is. Why does Lewis think that the humanitarian theory is inhumane? Okay, now note this. What Lewis calls the humanitarian theory, Menninger refers to as the therapeutic view. Okay, why does Lewis think the humanitarian theory or view is inhumane? According to Lewis, the humanitarian/therapeutic theory doesn't treat individual criminals as real moral agents, as accountable for what they've done. And it doesn't say there are clear limits to what we should be doing to criminals based on the criminals' choices and how serious their crimes were. So according to Lewis, the humanitarian/therapeutic view reduces people who are convicted of crimes to objects of social and psychiatric manipulation. In other words, what it says is, instead of saying, what does this person deserve based on that person's antisocial choices, it doesn't say that. It says, how can we make this person behave, especially in the future? How can we increase the likelihood that this person will be able to lead a productive, law-abiding life? Now, let me be clear about this. Let me be clear. C.S. Lewis is not saying that we shouldn't be at all concerned with reformation, nor is he saying we should be concerned with discouraging crime or deterrence. What Lewis was concerned about was that we would get rid of the whole notion of retributivism, and with it, the whole notion of what criminals deserve based on their choices. Okay, so according to Lewis, we should believe that most criminals, most of the time, are responsible for their choices and should be held accountable for those choices. And according to Lewis, the humanitarian/therapeutic theory doesn't treat criminals as responsible for their choices, but says they're more or less like little children or non-human animals, and that what we need to do is control them instead of giving them just punishment. Okay, in fact, according to Lewis, the humanitarian/therapeutic theory doesn't even talk about just punishment. And he says the only way you can really talk about just punishment and individual rights is to talk about what criminals deserve based on their choices. So in any event, those are the reasons that that Lewis believes humanitarian theory is in fact inhumane. You need to know also that according to Lewis, criminal justice can demand punishment. Okay, so the idea is that people should be judged on the basis of their actions. And sometimes people do heroic things, and they deserve that recognition. They deserve even some kind of award or reward. But there are other times when people fail to meet certain basic standards of civilization within a particular society, and Lewis says the people who do that need to be punished, and that's part of, in a sense, they've called that unto themselves. In a sense, they are asking for it by their choices. So now I want to talk about Brown. Okay, Harry Brown talked about three forms of morality. He talked about personal morality, he talked about universal morality, and he talked about absolute morality. Okay, now personal morality would be the idea that all people should personally define happiness and then devise means to try to maximize their chances of achieving it. Okay, that's what personal morality is. All people should pursue their enlightened self-interest. They should define happiness for themselves and try to create strategies for achieving that happiness. And they ought to be given free rein to do this within broad limits. Not, some limits, right? Because people, according to Brown, don't have a right to violate other people's rights. They don't have a right to use force, violence, or they don't have a right to defraud people. And so therefore, what they ought to do, if they're wise, he says, they ought to cooperate with other people for mutual advantage. But in any event, Brown believes in what he calls personal morality. Now, one thing that makes this a little complicated is that when Brown, what he calls personal morality, typically is not called that by professional philosophers. Because professional philosophers call his position ethical or rational egoism. Okay? And furthermore, they also say that it's an ethical or rational egoism of a universal or impersonal sort. In other words, the position that all people should pursue their enlightened self-interest is impersonal or universal, ethical or rational egoism. Another person who held that view was Ayn Rand. That's Aynrand, the novelist, the essayist, the philosopher. But in any event, I want you to know what personal morality is, and I want you to know that Harry Brown defended it. Furthermore, Harry Brown also talked about universal morality. Now, universal morality, like personal morality, says that we should try to achieve happiness, but there's a key difference. Universal morality, according to Harry Brown, says that there's really only one blueprint for happiness. There's only one road to happiness. There is one set of highly specific rules that everyone should follow. And Harry Brown says that's just unrealistic. It's completely unrealistic, Brown says, to think that everybody can be made happy by doing the same things, by having the same rules, the same strategies, the same blueprint for happiness. And so therefore he criticizes the universal view of morality as unrealistic. Now, there's also what he calls, finally, the absolute morality, or absolute view of morality. Now, that view says we should all follow the same rules, the same blueprint for, well, not for happiness, but for the sake of the rules and for the sake of the system. So what absolute morality says is that everybody should follow the same rules, even when following those rules requires sacrificing someone's happiness or even his or her life. So self-sacrifice is really at the core of absolute morality. And there are certain interpretations of some religions, and I emphasize certain interpretations because I don't want to overgeneralize, and I think you have to be really careful because there are different understandings within different religions, and it's a mistake to try to think that all religious people think the same. And believe me, that's a real mistake. But in any event, there are certain interpretations of some religions that Brown would say call for absolute morality. It says you need to follow these rules even if they result in your unhappiness or even the sacrifice of your life. Okay, now, but what's interesting is that there may be something that's a system of thought, an ideology, that's not at all like a conventional religion, or I should say, it's not a conventional religion. It's not a traditional religion. It's not. And yet, it could qualify as putting forward an absolute morality in Harry Brown's sense. Think of, for example, Nazism. Okay, now again, I'm not equating Nazism with any kind of religion, but I want you to understand something. Okay, we're talking about what he means by absolute morality. Okay, so here's this idea: Nazism says everybody must follow the same system. Everybody must follow the same rules. Okay, everybody must be willing to self-sacrifice. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So Nazism could qualify as absolute morality in his sense, that is, in Brown's sense. Okay, which one does he favor? He clearly favors personal morality. Why aren't all self-interested actions selfish? Okay, let's talk about this. Self-interested actions may not be selfish. Selfishness, according to Rachel's, selfishness occurs when people end up doing what they want while mistreating others. Okay, so that would be selfish. So when you use violence against someone for your own for your own benefit, for your self-interested benefit, that can be selfish. Okay, somebody's drowning, you can throw a rope, but you're eating your chalupa and you don't want to have a cold chalupa. Person drowns. That would be a selfish. Self-interestedness doesn't necessarily imply any kind of selfishness. For example, you could say that your shoe's untied, or as you're walking, and you tie it. That's self-interested. Doesn't mean it's selfish. Okay, so self-interestedness action could be morally neutral, or it could even be socially beneficial. You write a book that pleases millions of people, you become wealthy, you please millions of people, and therefore it's a win-win situation. But okay, so self-interested action could be morally neutral or beneficial. Selfish action necessarily is not going to be morally neutral, according to Rachel's. What are psychological and ethical egoism? Is there a consistent form of ethical or rational egoism? Okay, so psychological egoism says that all people always do what they believe is in their self-interest. Psychological egoism is in fact a descriptive theory. Psychological egoism, in fact, purports to describe how people, in fact, behave. Okay, Rachel's, of course, rejects it because he says sometimes people intentionally do what they believe is right, even at great personal cost. Okay, what is ethical egoism? Ethical egoism is a prescriptive theory. It recommends behavior, or it sets up a standard. You could call it a normative theory. It's about what ought or should be. And ethical egoism is typically divided or subdivided into two forms: universal or impersonal ethical / rational egoism. And they're the same, ethical and rational egoism. Okay, and that would say all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. And that position is pretty much the position of Harry Brown and as well as Ayn Rand. Okay, so again, ethical egoism is about what should be. It's a prescriptive or normative position. Psychological egoism is about what supposedly is. Okay, it's a descriptive theory. Is there a consistent form of ethical or rational egoism? According to Rachel's, there is, and that consistent form is what he calls personal ethical egoism. Okay, so look, we've got. Let me say this again. Ethical egoism or rational egoism really is subdivided into impersonal or universal ethical or rational egoism and personal ethical or rational egoism. So let's get clear about that. And let's say that what is okay, we said that the universal or impersonal form says that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. That's the position that Harry Brown has taken. That is the position of Ayn Rand. Okay, so then the question is, well, what is personal ethical egoism? Well, let's suppose that Popeye is a personal ethical egoist, and that means that Popeye believes that Popeye, should promote his enlightened self-interest, but he doesn't believe that anyone else should promote his or her self-interest. In fact, he'd prefer that other people promote his, that is Popeye's self-interest, right? Okay, so then the question is, how does Rachel's view personal ethical egoism? Well, according to Rachel's, Personal ethical egoism is a logically consistent position. There's nothing inherently contradictory about it. There's nothing instrumentally or practically contradictory about it. In other words, someone could actually apply it to the real world. He says it's possible for some individual to believe that he or she should constantly promote his or her self-interest under all circumstances. And it's possible that somebody could actually do that. But Rachel's condemns personal ethical egoism. Now, why? He doesn't say it's inconsistent. He doesn't attack it on logical grounds. Rather, he says that it is morally unacceptable because it could lead someone to mistreat others simply for his or her own benefit. Okay? And let me say something further. Rachel's believes that most people wouldn't want always to act egoistically, always to put themselves above others. He says they can handle it maybe most of the time, but not all the time, because they could end up seriously mistreating other people simply for their own benefit, and he thinks that most people don't have the stomach or the conscience to do that. So he doesn't think that most people would want to be personal ethical egoists. But I need to shift gears slightly. So then the question is, okay, if Rachel's attack, we know that he attacks psychological egoism, the descriptive theory, by saying that it's an overgeneralization. He says that there are people many people, who sometimes do what they believe is right, even knowing that they're going to be suffering because of that. And so he rejects psychological egoism as just false to the way the world actually functions. But he also rejects every form of egoism he discusses, which means that he also discusses and rejects universal or impersonal ethical/rational egoism. And that says that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. As a matter of fact, Rachel's believes that impersonal or universal ethical or rational egoism, remember that's the position of Ayn Rand and also Harry Brown, he believes that that position will lead to practical inconsistencies whenever two or more persons interact with conflicting interests. Okay, so suppose it's in someone's interest to defraud somebody and to illicitly take their money through deception, but it's in the other person's interest not to be defrauded. Then the question becomes, whose interest should prevail? The fraudsters, or the victims? Whose interest should prevail? According to not Harry Brown, but according to Rachel's, who criticizes all forms of egoism, the theory can't tell us. And he thinks that any sound ethical theory ought to help us arbitrate between and among conflicting interests. So now, I don't want to go too deeply into this. Obviously, the people who defend ethical egoism, including the universal form of it, such as Ayn Rand, believe that it can be a logically self-consistent position. And Ayn Rand thought that an ethical egoist can recognize individual rights as limits on what an individual can do in the name of self-interest. Okay, we don't have to worry about that. I just want you to know that according to Rachel's, universal/impersonal ethical/rational egoism will be inconsistent in practice whenever there are two or more persons interacting with conflicting interests. And I want you to know that. But I also want you to know that Rachel's believes that personal ethical egoism is not at all inconsistent, but it's morally unacceptable because it could lead someone to mistreat other people simply for his or her own benefit. Okay, now, then the question is, why does Rachel's reject all forms of egoism? We've just discussed that. He rejects psychological egoism because he thinks it's a false universal description. He thinks there are many people who do what they believe is right, even though they know they'll be subordinating their interest to doing what is right. Why doesn't Rachel's believe that most people want to be rational egoists? Well, again, we're talking about personal rational egoists, which it's the only kind of rational egoism he thinks will be logically consistent. Well, the answer here is that Rachel's believes that most people are not going to want to act egoistically in all circumstances, because then they could end up mistreating people, and they don't want to do that. Most people have, to some degree, a conscience, even for strangers, and so that's why he thinks that most people wouldn't want to be rational egoists. Are some actions, according to Rachel's, neither rationally self-interested nor altruistic? In other words, concern to help others. And the answer is that Rachel thinks yes, there are some actions that people do that are not, they're not in their rational self-interest, and they're not done to help others. And these would include highly impulsive, self-destructive actions. Okay? So somebody could, for example, desperately need to keep his job, but then cuss out and then beat up the boss. That would be, and then lose the job. That would be an example of someone who's doing something that is not in the person's rational self-interest and not, in fact, done for altruistic reasons. Okay, or somebody, some young guys get together and see how much wild turkey bourbon they can drink in a half hour. Typically, that can be very harmful to people, by the way. And typically, that's not done in enlightened self-interest, nor is it done to benefit others. Okay, what is Stace's view of ethical relativism? Okay, Stace was a philosopher who criticized ethical relativism. Now remember, Stace's view is that there are some actions that are just plain wrong. For example, Hitler's ordering that millions of members of minorities be killed, including women, children, just wiped out. Whether it's Jewish people, whether whether it was gypsies, gay people, and so on, just wipe them out. That's what the Nazis did. And somebody like Stace would say, well, that's just plain wrong, and it doesn't matter whether it was legal. It doesn't matter whether it was institutionalized. It doesn't matter if most people in that society approved of it, even assuming that they knew about it and did. He said this doesn't matter. There's certain things that are just plain wrong. Okay, so Stace believes that ethical relativism is a flawed theory, that it's false. Stace believes, again, that there's certain standards that will apply to everybody at all times, such as, perhaps I think he would say, the golden rule: treat people the way you want to be treated. Okay, so he rejects relativism. How does he criticize it? Well, he says that ethical relativism implies that anything could be right, regardless of whether it clearly mistreats individuals or minorities and violates the golden rule. That anything could be right, provided that you got a majority to go along with it, and you institutionalized it, you made it a part of the customs or laws or both of a society. And he says that he just thinks that's implausible. He thinks there's certain things that are just plain wrong, and they're not made right simply because they're popular. Furthermore, Stace believed that it at least makes sense to talk about real moral progress as opposed to moral change. Okay? So, for example, historically, if you go back far enough, the usual view was that there was a tribal morality and that one owed all sorts of duties to other members of the tribe, but one could treat as relatively unimportant people outside the tribe. For example, let's get more concrete. It was widely believed thousands of years ago that it would be wrong to sell spoiled meat to a member of one's own tribe, but it would be quite permissible to do it to people outside the tribe. And then over time, more and more people came to say, including religious people, including prophets, that everybody's morally important, everyone's your neighbor, everyone counts. Okay, and so some people would say that that is not simply moral change, that is moral progress. It's an expansion of the moral imagination. And furthermore, Stace says it makes sense at least to think of the possibility of moral wisdom, the possibility that some individual, okay, whether it's a prophet or a philosopher, could be wiser than the multitudes. Okay, so for example, let's take Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that all people are worthy of dignity. All people should be treated equally under the law. That it was just plain wrong to treat black people in America as second-class citizens and deny them their rights and not let them go to other businesses, the businesses that white people are going to, not making them go to the back of the bus when they got on a bus, so on. He says this is plain wrong, and it doesn't matter that it was legal to treat people as second class. It doesn't matter. He says just plain wrong. And so some people think that he was in fact more enlightened, wiser than multitudes who many of whom defended those racial segregation practices and laws. Okay, so in any event, I want you to know that Stace criticizes ethical relativism, and of course, I want you to know that Stace was a philosopher, and Ruth Benedict was an anthropologist, and Ruth Benedict ended up defending cultural relativism. Now, I know some of you are wondering, well, what is Professor Evans doing? He meant for a moment he's talked about ethical relativism, and now he's talking about cultural relativism, and what's the difference? Okay. Well, cultural relativism is a more inclusive term, and it includes this idea that that standards of morality, standards of normality, standards of rationality or reasonableness, and standards of beauty are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. Okay? So, in other words, cultural relativism includes ethical relativism, it includes normality relativism, rationality relativism, and beauty relativism. Okay? So, you're an ethical relativist to the extent that you believe that standards of right and wrong are relative to perspective and depend either on groups and their values or on individuals. In other words, instead of saying, well, this action is wrong because of its nature or its consequences, you say, no, it's right according to that group of people, wrong according to that group of people. That's a form of ethical relativism. That's something that Stace rejected, but Benedict was in fact defending it at one point in her career. She was defending it. She defended it in the essay that we read. Okay, so she held that, first of all, she held that standards of normality are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture, but she also held that standards of morality or ethical standards are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. So I want you to know that Stace criticized ethical relativism. And ethical relativism, you could also regard it as one of the ingredients in cultural relativism. Anyway, he criticized ethical relativism, and he also, so thereby also criticized Benedict's view. And Benedict defended cultural relativism, which includes ethical relativism. I want you to know something about Kai Nielsen's view of the divine command theory. Okay, so the divine command theory says that basically what is right and wrong will be determined by God's orders, God's prohibitions. Right? Okay, and it's more complex than it sounds, because people have to know, well, how are they going to define? What do you mean by God? How are you going to determine that you accurately interpreting God? What do you do if you have conflicting interpretations of what God wants? It could happen within the same book, or it could happen between and among different holy books. But in any event, so there are all sorts of complications and complexities. But I do want you to know what Nielsen says about the divine command theory. So here's the key thing. The divine command theory ties right and wrong to God's commands and to God, of course. Now, Nielsen believes that we can have good reasons for approving of something or disapproving of it morally. If some practice helps us get along with one another, some practice helps us reduce or prevent social conflict, if some practice helps us reduce or prevent suffering, we have moral reasons, good moral reasons for judging that practice along those lines and on those bases. Okay, now, and so therefore we don't need to resort to religion or a belief in a creator to judge morality. So here's what I want you to understand about Nielsen. Nielsen says the following. He says, when it comes to ethical monotheisms, okay, think of, for example, Judaism, think of Christianity, think of, in addition to that, think of Islam. Okay, so these are, if you like, religious systems, okay, that believe in a personal God and a personal creator who cares about human beings, right? Creator of the universe, and whose will is directly connected to right and wrong. Okay, in any event, so think about ethical monotheisms. What Nielsen is saying, that he says, if you're an ethical monotheist, like a believing Jewish person, a Christian, or Muslim, then you will necessarily believe in moral goodness. Now, why is that? Well, that's because in those religions assume that the Creator is morally good, and so that's supposed to be an essential feature of the Creator in those religions. So just like if somebody believes in puppies and somebody believes in young animals, if somebody believes in triangles and the person believes in three-sided figures, right? And so what he says is, yes, there's a logical or conceptual connection between certain religious beliefs and a belief in moral goodness, so that you can say that if somebody's a believing Jewish person, a believing Christian, or a believing Muslim, then necessarily that person believes in moral goodness, because to the extent that that person believes in God, with a capital G, a God of those religions, that person believes in moral goodness. But, and this is key, but Nielsen says somebody can believe in moral goodness without necessarily believing in God. In other words, somebody can believe that honesty is morally good because of the role it plays in our lives, because of its good consequences, because of the way in which it helps us get along with one another and respect one another. And so somebody can believe that honesty is morally good without necessarily being religious or even believing in God. Okay. So again, let me say it again. According to Nielsen, and this connects to the divine command theory, he says, yes, if somebody is religious and is a religious Jewish person, a Christian or Muslim, the person must believe in moral goodness, because that's supposed to be an essential attribute of God. But someone could believe in moral goodness and believe that honesty is morally good without necessarily believing in God or being at all religious. Okay. So in that sense, you could say that he doesn't, that is, Nielsen doesn't believe that morality philosophically requires a belief in religion or a belief in God. Now, how does libertarianism disagree with socialism? Okay. Now, there are some different definitions of socialism. If you took like a textbook definition of it, and especially in the 19th century, it would talk about the public ownership of the means of production and distribution, when the government is supposed to be like owning the businesses and, in fact, regulating, controlling the economy, redistributing income, and so on. Okay, so that's one of the really textbook definitions of it. But even if you have a looser view of socialism, and you believe that if you have a looser view, you might believe that it can involve a great deal of redistribution of income, and the government's is going to be intimately involved in the economy, regulating wages, regulating businesses, again, redistributing income, and possibly even owning some industries. But in any event, socialism, if you follow it more strictly or if you follow it more loosely, it's still going to include the government's having a major role in the economy. And so the libertarian is going to want to minimize the government's role in our lives and to maximize individual freedom and individual responsibility. So libertarianism is not identical with anarchy, but it's a belief in minimal government. Okay, and so libertarians believe in a military, they believe in a court system, they believe in criminal law and all that, but libertarians want to minimize the government's role in our lives, including the government's role in the economy. So no matter how you look at it, a libertarian is not going to want nearly as much government involvement in the economy as a socialist. Okay. Now, the other thing is, why does Ewing disagree with utilitarianism? So let's be careful here. Ewing's essay is called A Critique of Utilitarianism. And indeed, most of his essay criticizes utilitarianism. Okay. Now and especially it criticizes utilitarianism to be a guide to ordinary people in everyday circumstances. And it ends up saying that if somebody were a consistent utilitarian, if all people were, you could have parents who are not treating their children properly. Okay. You could have a parent who says, you know what, it's true, my son could use a college education, but you know what, I can use all this money and do more good with it if I gave it to a charity. Okay, so what he's saying is he doesn't think that the ordinary person in everyday life should always think like a utilitarian. But, and this is interesting, near the end of Ewing's essay, he does think that utilitarianism should be used as one of the major standards for creating, implementing, and evaluating public laws, regulation, and forms of government. In forms of government, you could talk about communism, you could talk about Nazism, you could talk about the kind of government we have. In any event, that's his position. His position is that the average person in everyday circumstances should not always think like a utilitarian. But if someone's a politician, if somebody's creating various public regulations, if somebody's trying to create a government, it is quite legitimate. In fact, he thinks it's valuable to have utilitarianism as one of the major standards for doing those things. Now, why is that? Because he says we expect laws, regulations, and we expect governments, at the very least, to reduce suffering and to be concerned with the collective happiness, because all those things can affect the welfare of millions of people. So he does think that utilitarianism is properly used as one of the major standards for creating laws and judging the laws, and creating regulations and judging them and evaluating them, and creating governments and judging them. And he believes that if it's true, and I'm sure he's right that it is true, that Nazism created a lot more suffering than it did happiness. Those are strong grounds for condemning Nazism on utilitarian grounds. Okay, so he does think that Ewing does, that utilitarianism has some value, but particularly in the way that I suggested, according to him. Name 3 utilitarians. Well, we could mention Bentham, B-E-N-T-H-A-M. We could also mention Mill, John Stuart Mill, M-I-L-L, and we could mention E. Daniel Kay. So Bentham was born in the 1700s, died in the 1800s, died in like 1832 or so. Mill was born in 1806, died in 1873. And then if you're talking about E. Daniel Kay, he was born in the 20th century. Okay? But all of those would be examples of utilitarians. Why does Cohen defend socialism? Well, Cohen believed that, he died some years back, but Cohen believed that socialism would involve applying democratic principles to the world of the economy. And he thought that socialism would be better for the average person and certainly better for poor people. He thought that socialism would enormously reduce huge differences in wealth and income, and that generally society would be happier if it were socialized in the way that he thought. Now, you also need to know something about Carol Gilligan. Now, Carol Gilligan was or is a psychologist, and for many years she was associated with Harvard University. And she, now you're going to get one question for her, related to her, and she's not on any test, but will be on the final. One question. So this is the last reading called A Different Voice. So Carol Gilligan, through her research and that of others, came to the conclusion that men and women tend to think differently about many values. Let's be more specific. She held that men as a group, and there are going to be lots of individual exceptions, but men generally tend to value abstract principles such as the Golden Rule and justice, tend to value also personal autonomy and individualism and individual rights, tend to value privacy, individual space, tend to value let's say rights, individual rights, more than women. But that women, she says, as a group, tend to put more stress on relationships, more stress on interdependence, the extent to which we're dependent on one another, tend to put more stress on mercy than justice, okay? Tend to put more emphasis on carrying in compassion than reason and abstract principles. Okay, so according to Carol Gilligan, if we're going to be fair to women and fair to the complexity of the moral life, we need to value both sides of the values. That is to say, we need to have more esteem for the values that women have a higher degree of esteem for than men have a degree of esteem for. In other words, we need to value both justice and mercy, and we need to give more attention to mercy than we have until the last few decades. She says, furthermore, that women's voices should be heard, because she says morality requires a delicate balancing of competing but complementary values. Morality requires both justice and mercy. It requires an esteem for reason and an esteem for caring and concern. It requires an emphasis on individual rights, but also the need for independence and our esteem for our relationships. So, according to Gilligan, historically, philosophical theories of ethics and also psychological theories of moral development have been biased against women in favor of men, and it may be they may have been subconscious. So I should say let me say this. I should be more clear. Subconsciously biased. In other words, it may not have been conscious bias. And so what she's saying is that because more men than women have created ethical theories and philosophy, more than men than women have created psychological theories of moral development, there's been a kind of unconscious or subconscious bias against women in favor of men in the masculine point of view. Okay, so I want you to know that. I want you to know that Harold Gilligan is saying that men and women tend to think differently. Again, there are going to be lots of individual exceptions, though. Tend to think differently about a number of values. That men tend and emphasize abstract reason and justice and the golden rule and personal freedom, personal autonomy more than women, and women tend to emphasize more, if you like, relationships, more interdependence, more mercy rather than justice. In any event, so I want you to understand that, and if you know what I've just said, I think you'll be in great shape for that one question on the final exam. So again, to get back to what I said before, I think it would be very good for you to closely reread the assigned readings, closely study the completed review sheet I've given you, and I'd create flashcards from the completed review sheet. And I would repeatedly, and when I say create them, not just create them, I'd use them, right? Shuffle them. You can create flashcards for various terms and their definitions for the different positions of the different thinkers. And I repeatedly watch this review lecture while pausing it to paraphrase content and maybe even trying to teach the material to someone else. I mean, even if you did that to stuffed animals, you'd be better off than simply reading and rereading the material. But trying to paraphrase the material and to express it in a lecture, ideally with someone else. But even if you didn't, just paraphrasing it and creating your own lecture to your stuffed animals could have value. Okay, if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. You can email me. We could also, if you like, we could have some phone chat about anything we've covered. But if you follow my advice, I think you will do well on the final exam. Now remember, the final exam covers material from the second test and the third test, but nothing from the first test. And it also will cover there'll be one question from a different voice by Carol Gilligan. So I want you to understand that. It'll be 40 questions, true, false, multiple choice, each question counting 2.5 points. Okay, so I think that's all you need to know about the final exam. Thank you.